So the risk management in Formwork is probably the most exciting feature, and I'm not sure if it's smart from a marketing point of view to actually show it last when everyone has already fallen asleep and looked at the document reviewing workflow, which is way more boring. But I guess those are that's the way things are right now. So if you navigate to the left side, you can actually see the risk stuff is in yellow. We'll actually switch projects here for a second. What I call risk management test, because I actually created some data in there. Now, the first thing you would create for your risk management would be your risk table. And this looks more intimidating than it actually is. It's actually really, really simple. As a first step, you determine, well, what are the things which can go wrong in your software? You could have like a minor injury leading up to other things, other things being more severe than that minor injury. And the worst thing could maybe be death. And then you come up with probability categories. These are only like brackets of probabilities. You would typically start by 100% and go down to 0%. And in this case, we always have intervals of 10 to the power of 2 in between. But this is kind of like up to you. This is always how we do it. And I've also seen other people do it in very weird ways where you like assign scores and not real probabilities, which I think doesn't really make sense because we're talking about probabilities here, right? Which is for me like this float number. Anyway, based on that, Formwork generates the risk matrix for you, which I think is so cool. So you don't have to manually create this. It automatically generates it for you. So you can see all the severity categories on the top, minor injury and death and everything in between. And the probability categories are also here, and they're rows. So you can see the probability category 1, the most likely thing is at the top. Now if we create like a new severity category, let's actually have a look at how that looks. And something like, oh yeah, more than death. I entered that in the past. That's great. Like, who knows? Maybe there's something worse than death. Save it. And you can see our risk table actually got extended with this severity category. And we could maybe say, okay, maybe death is generally mostly not acceptable, but maybe more than death is always acceptable. So this is like how you determine that certain things are acceptable or not. It's so intuitive, you just click on it and like the color changes, which I think is super intuitive. I mean, even my mom would understand this. And like, my mom is generally smart, but like risk management is not easy to understand for most people getting into it. And I think this makes it as intuitive as it can be. Let's actually delete this again because more than death might not make a whole lot of sense. You can see risk table has been updated again. So what would be acceptable here? I don't know, maybe actually this would be acceptable. We would say, well, death is generally never acceptable. Irreversible injury is maybe acceptable if it happens like super rarely, and so on and so on. Minor injury is always acceptable. Well, it depends on your product, right? So this is like where I guess consulting still comes in, but not that much. Now, when we're done with that, we would actually go to the risk table. And the risk table has this really cool overview of things, which I'm not getting into right now to not confuse you. I actually open an entry here because that is a better way of explaining it first. So the application we're looking at, the medical device we're looking at here is this COVID diagnosis device, which I just came up with, probably in my dreams or so. So it's a completely fictional app where you like, I don't know, take a picture of someone and the app tells you like, oh my God, this person has COVID, or it doesn't. I mean, technically it's impossible based on a picture, but it's just an example here. Now, what would possible risks of this software be? Well, clearly, if it makes a wrong diagnosis, the worst case would be if someone who has COVID actually gets the diagnosis of, well, the app tells them they're healthy, and then they stay at home, don't get treatment, and then their COVID disease progresses in a worse way than if they would have gotten treatment. And this is exactly something which you can model in Formwork, which I think is so cool because, again, it's so intuitive. So you have a hazard. You always have these three things: hazard, hazardous situation, and harm. The hazard is the wrong diagnosis happens in the app. The hazardous situation, that would be the next step, would be the patient actually believes that wrong diagnosis. And the harm would be the delayed treatment of COVID when the patient, well, actually has COVID, gets a wrong diagnosis, stays at home, and so on. Everything what we talked about. you can see these things actually have intermediate probabilities. So the probability of someone after getting a wrong diagnosis actually believing that, we could assume maybe that's 10%, because 90% of people might like not trust the diagnosis if it's clearly wrong. And then again, the probability of someone who's believed that getting a delayed treatment of COVID is maybe 10% again. I mean, that's actually a medical question. Like, how many people do have a severe outcome of COVID, which would be relevant here? I don't know the numbers, so 10% is just like for demonstration purposes here. You can also add risk controls. So you can see we actually added 2 risk controls here, which said a physician has to confirm the diagnosis, which is very abstract. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Like a physician, I don't know, comes by in like a helicopter and says like, oh yeah, the app diagnosis is correct. I don't know. Well, it's a fictional example. And you could maybe add other risk controls like usability testing. You can maybe say, well, we do crazy usability testing, which maybe also tells the user to, well, not trust the diagnosis if it's clearly wrong. And that could be maybe used as a risk control. Then you say like, okay, by how much do these risk controls actually reduce the probability, and do they reduce the severity? Well, they do reduce the probability, right? I can reduce the probability of this harm occurring if I do these risk controls. But I probably can't reduce the severity, because the severity, well, the severity is delayed treatment of COVID, and that's just the outcome there is. Like, regardless of how many risk controls I do there, like it's still the outcome. So in my opinion, severity category doesn't change. That's also what we entered here. And then the Formwork automatically determines that this risk table entry is acceptable. So how does it determine that? Now, it determines that looking into your risk matrix. So we can actually see what was acceptable here. So we have some sort of, what did we have here? Reversible injury, so category 2. And then the probability is 0.1 times 0.1 times 0.1. So we're probably in the second cell here. So if we actually change that and go back and refresh the page, interesting. So actually now it's not acceptable anymore, which totally makes sense because we changed the relevant cell in the risk table matrix. So this is how Formwork works. Let's fix that again. So it's nice and acceptable again. And again, as always, all of this stuff is versioned, so it's like saved for each version of your software. So you can always go back in time and show auditors how your risk table actually looked like in the past. Now, we skipped over certain things when we actually looked at this overview. This overview is simply just a more elaborate, oh, not really elaborate, a more condensed view of all the risk entries you have. We just looked at this entry, which has the wrong diagnosis, patient believing them, delayed treatment, blah, 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 blah. It actually tells you, well, is it acceptable before risk controls and after risk controls? And ours just now actually wouldn't have been acceptable before risk controls, but it would have been acceptable after. So that's interesting. If you have risk controls, they're entered in this blue column here. And then you have all these other things I entered sometime in the past. For example, this next risk is actually the same one, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense here. And it doesn't have any risk controls. So that's how something looks if it doesn't have any risk controls. How do you edit these things? So you click edit, who would have thought? And again, I think this is so self-explanatory. You select a hazard, select a hazardous situation, select a harm, enter these intermediate probabilities, enter risk controls if you have them. We actually only have 2, which we can select from. Enter the probability reduction. If the severity category stays the same, you don't have to select it, describe it, and save it. And that's all there is. Now, maybe the next and final question would be, how do you create all these things? Well, you actually have this separate section here where you can create hazards, hazardous situations, harms, and risk controls. So hazards and hazardous situations are really not really that interesting to create. Harms are slightly more interesting to create. So let's actually create one. So a harm could be, well, here we had delayed treatment of COVID. Another typical harm could be something like, okay, like a person gets stressed out for some reason, like, I don't know, like acute stress reaction. Maybe because they also get a wrong diagnosis, but it's false positive. So it tells them, oh my God, you have COVID, but the person is super healthy. And they would be like, oh my God, this is so stressful because the app tells me I have COVID and am I going to die now? If someone maybe has these tendencies, maybe it actually could be stressful. So let's call this stress reaction, and you have to assign a severity category here, the severity categories we looked at earlier. And what would that be? We probably don't need medical attention for this stress reaction, so let's call it a minor injury. Save it. And there you go. It's a new harm, and now we could use that in risk table entries. Same for risk controls and all the other stuff. I'm not going to show you that because it's all the same. It's all just forms. That's why it's called Formwork. All right, cool. Now, how would you, for example, link a software requirement to risk? And that's really interesting. You have some intermediate thing called failure modes. So failure modes are something on a technical level. On a technical level, things which can go wrong in your software. So what could go wrong? Actually, maybe your database gets hacked, right? Like database gets hacked and data is publicly accessible. Could describe it here, and we could link it to certain things. I'm actually not going to link it right now. I'm going to link it from the other side, which will be more interesting. Because for each software requirement, you need to actually determine which hazards or which failure modes there could be leading to certain hazards. So if we have the software requirement here, calculate COVID score, well, that isn't suitable. Let's create a new one and say like, okay, database. We had a similar one just now, like data gets saved to database. And now this is interesting because now we can link it to this failure mode and say like, okay, the database actually maybe gets hacked. Oh, actually we have another one here, database explodes. That also makes sense. Then you save it, and there you go. So now we actually have software requirements linked to your failure modes. And I think while this may, like from this user interface point of view, this looks so simple, and that's exactly the point, because Formwork is meant to be very, very simple. You can't even customize these fields because it's exactly what you need to document for your compliance with certain standards. So this might not work if you're like a 100-person company with all sorts of fancy processes and fancy things to document. But this may definitely work if you're like a 10-person company trying to bring a medical device to market really quickly. So that's all there is. In my opinion, one of the coolest features of Formwork, which makes things just so easy and so intuitive. And imagine doing this in a spreadsheet. Imagine trying to link software requirements to failure modes and then failure modes to risk table entries with this whole matrix thing going on. I think it's going to be a huge mess. And while from experience, it always is a huge mess because that's what we see when we do consulting. And I think Formwork can really, really help you in doing this in a more intuitive and simple way, but most importantly, you'll be done just so much faster. All right, that's it for now. So that was a Formwork Pro feature. Hope you're going to purchase Formwork Pro now. If you have any questions, reach out anytime, and yeah, have fun trying it out.